Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's top 20 episodes of 2018. In this video I count down my top 20 favorite episodes from any show that was released in 2018. To be clear, the time period I'm judging this by is starting in late December 2017 through mid-December of 2018. So basically episodes that maybe came out after I made my top 20 favorite episodes video last year, and obviously I can't include videos that came out after I'm making this video in mid-December. So it was basically 2018, any episode from any show that came out in this time period and was made available to me in the country that I live in. So it was released here in New Zealand between this time period. So for this video, I'm going to be looking at, all the shows that I've watched. I've watched like over 26 shows, and regardless of how well I think the overall show worked or how well the season worked, I'm looking specifically at the episodes and picking my favorite episodes from each show. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll start with my number 20 favorite episode of 2018, and that is the USS CALLISTER from Black Mirror. Now, this was a very dark and twisted episode. It was a lot of fun and had a bit more of a light-hearted side than most Black Mirror episodes do, but it still was a bit dark. It did have a Star Trek theme to it, although I wouldn't say it was a direct parody of Star Trek. It wasn't trying to present this show. I think it was called Space Fleet. It wasn't trying to present it as Star Trek and making commentary on Star Trek. It was just using it as a backdrop for a twisted story that actually had a lot more to say about the fans of Star Trek than it did about the show itself, and what it had to say was not very good. But it was mainly about this one twisted guy who wanted to use people as their own personal playthings, so he made digital copies of them so he could torture them. Very interesting episode. Anyway, get into my number 19, which is The Passenger from Westworld. So this was the season finale of Westworld Season 2. A lot of people were heavily disappointed in this. A lot of people hated this. A lot of people will say it's the worst of the show. I don't see it. I personally disagree with that. I love this. I think this is definitely one of the strengths of Westworld as a whole. I thought it was absolutely fascinating to see this, all the revelations of the different time frames they had going on through Season 2 collide and come together, and see this epic struggle go down where you learn that people aren't exactly who you think they are. So I absolutely love this episode. So anyway, we'll get into my number 18, which is Part 7 from The Sinner. So The Sinner Season 2 I didn't like as much as Season 1, but I did really enjoy this episode in particular. I think this is definitely the strongest of the season. It had I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but it had a revelation the character that you thought was dead was not really dead, and it followed her backstory, and there was a couple of really powerful emotional scenes, particularly one involving a phone call, and if you've seen this episode, you know what I'm talking about. It had me in tears. I wasn't as thrilled with the next episode and how they concluded these storylines. I thought I wasn't as happy with that, but this episode in particular I thought was very powerful. So anyway, we get into my number 17, which is COUSHATTA from Better Call Saul. This episode was pretty hilarious, where Jim and McGill and Kim set up a scheme to try to get Huel out of trouble with the law, and so he sets up this fake campaign from Huel's hometown, where he gets all these people, pays people a lot of money to just write letters to the courtroom, and he has a lot of phone numbers, so he's sitting there with a whole shitload of different cell phones, and he puts on different voices, like, oh, I know old Huel. I mean, that was absolutely hilarious. I was cracking up loud. I think this was the funniest episode of Better Call Saul, but more than that, it explored Jimmy and Kim's really twisted relationship, and how the relationship was falling apart, but when they pulled off this con together, they actually made Kim more in love with Jimmy, and their relationship got even bigger. So it was very interesting on many different levels. Anyway, we'll get into my number 16, which is Despite Yourself from Star Trek Discovery. Wasn't the hugest fan of Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery. I thought the pacing was really off and very disjointed. But this is one episode in particular I thought I loved. I thought it really worked. This was, I guess, the mid-season premiere, you would call it, when at the first half of the season I wasn't as thrilled with. But this episode came and it blew me away. I was not expecting the show to get this good. And I think and do believe a lot of why this episode worked had to do with Jonathan Frakes' direction. He directed this episode. He did an amazing job at doing it. There were a couple of huge revelations, which again, I don't want to get into spoilers, but the way they were handled in this episode was absolutely amazing. And of course, the whole episode was about Discovery being trapped in the Mirror Universe, and it had this high tension, high stakes. And it's actually my favorite of the Mirror Universe arc. Where some people would look to some of the later episodes, but for me, this was the most technically well executed. It had some shocking moments, which again I don't want to give away, and it was just the way it was filmed, the acting involved. Absolutely loved it. So anyway, we'll get into my number 15, which is Immolation from the Expanse. So this is the episode mid-season, I would say, of Season 3 of The Expanse, where everything comes to a head. On Io, you have the Martian forces, the dirty UN forces led by Aaron Wright's sort of conspiracy, and the two are going to war with each other, while at the same time Holden is on the surface trying to capture Jules Pierre Mao and put an end to the protomolecule hybrids, and Bobby Draper has to come face to face with their fears and face the protomolecule hybrid straight on. And of course you get the best, most amazing quote of the entire show, where Amos says, "I am that guy." So absolutely amazing episode. So anyway, next we get into my number 14, which is They Reminisce Over You from Luke Cage. Now, I enjoyed Luke Cage Season 2 probably a lot more than most. I actually really loved Season 2 of Luke Cage. This episode in particular blew me away. This was the season finale of Season 2 of Luke Cage, where you get a couple deaths of some characters that we've been following for quite some time. You get some character changes and turns, but the biggest character changes you have is Luke Cage himself, who it ends the season with him becoming like this gangster type, where he's always been the hero, the one who's been fighting this organized crime, but he realizes that he can't wipe out, like he can't stop organized crime from happening. It'll always be there, so he elects instead to become his boss within the organized crime community in order to try to control it. But then you get the hints that he's going to be corrupted by this, and I love that. It was such an out of left field way to take this show. It was very non-typical for these superhero shows, so I absolutely loved it. Anyway, we'll get into my number 13, which is It Reaches Out from the Expanse. This is a pretty exciting episode where you have Holden seeing this Miller construct that's not making any sense, is starting to drive him insane. Well, meanwhile, you have the reporters on his ship filming him, and he's trying to hide the fact that he's going a bit crazy. And then, of course, you have the plot with Melba framing the Rosinante for destroying a UN ship. And so it has the ending sequence at the end of this episode. Absolutely blew me away, like the music, the way it was filmed. It was one of the most intense scenes from anything this year, where all the ships wanted to destroy the Rosinante because they thought they were responsible for a terrorist attack of destroying the UN ship. So Holden had to go run and talk to this Miller construct and tell him what to do. And he tells Holden to check his doors and corners, which is really telling him to go inside the ring gate. So he makes a run for it. Really intense, amazing scene. Anyway, we'll get into my number 12, which is a new napkin from Daredevil. This, again, is the season finale of Daredevil Season 3. Amazing season. I think the best season of any Marvel Netflix show. And the ending dealt with the whole entire season. Matt Murdock, Daredevil, and his friends were just constantly being defeated by the Kingpin. The Kingpin was just owning them and just defeating them. And finally we get this finale where Daredevil is able to strike back against the Kingpin, finally defeat him against all odds, and he's able to use Bullseye, who's acting all crazy, as he reveals that the woman that he loved was actually killed by Kingpin, and so he goes all crazy and wants to kill Kingpin. So this is dynamic where Devil is trying to arrest Kingpin, trying to stop Bullseye from killing Kingpin, but at the same time trying to stop Kingpin from getting away. Really intense, amazing episode. So next we'll get into my number 11, which is Vanishing Point from Westworld. So this was a really interesting episode that explored William and his character and his backstory. You get flashbacks to his that explain his relationship with his daughter and his relationship with his wife. You find out that his daughter's intentions in going into Westworld to retrieve him are not actually good, that she blames him for her mother's death. And it has a very twisted, very dark ending. I thought this was a very effectively dark episode. I quite liked it. So now let's get into my top 10 favorite episodes of 2018. And we'll start with my number 10, The Sincerest Form of Flattery from Counterpart. Now this was quite a standout episode from Counterpart for me, because it took a character that was barely in the show, like a minor character, and I think the episode before this, you find out a huge revelation about this character. This character is a spy and has been a spy from Parallel Universe all along, and you get her. It follows her backstory. So the whole episode is focused on her and her backstory. So it takes all the other main characters like J.K. Simmons and all those. They barely appear in this episode. And I love when shows are brave enough to do that. And I think this episode in particular paid off in spades. By doing that. It was a very good character exploration. It was very dark, very interesting. So that was a great episode. So anyway, we'll get into my number 9, which is Windmills from Maniac. Maniac is another show I absolutely loved this year. I thought it was an amazing show. This episode in particular was the second episode that went into the backstory of Emma Stone's character, Annie, and why it was that she was addicted to this pill that could only be found on this drug trial, and you see her go through the drug trial, and it's it has that very twisted feel that Maniac does best, where she like goes to the blackmail store to blackmail a person, and she, in order to blackmail him, she pretends to work for this company where you can hire a friend. Very twisted, interesting stuff, but she manages to get into the drug trial, and then you get her backstory of why it was she was so depressed. You see her with her sister, and how she's being such an asshole to her sister, and being very mean, but then of course they get in a car crash and she dies. Very tragic, very emotional, very powerful episode. Absolutely loved it. So anyway, we'll get into my number 8, which is The Lost Art of Forehead Sweat from The X-Files. Now, Season 11 of The X-Files I wasn't a huge fan of. I did think it was better than Season 10, which I had some issues with, but I still wasn't that big on the season as a whole. But this episode was awesome. I maintain and will always maintain that this is the best comedy episode of the entire series of The X-Files. Come at me. I absolutely love this episode. In fact, I would say this would be in my top 5 episodes of the entire series of X-Files, period. Like, this episode was absolutely hilarious as it played in this guy who was saying that he was there on The X-Files all along, and then you see, like, they show certain scenes from earlier episodes of The X-Files, and the guy was saying that he was the third agent who was also partnered with Mulder and Scully, so you get the scenes where they superimpose him in the scenes. He was like, uh-oh, that's weird. I mean, that was hilarious. But on top of that, you get the Dr. They, who was like, who's they? Oh, they is Dr. They. And this Dr. They comes, is like talking about his YouTube comments. Absolutely hilarious. And of course, like at the very end, this is probably the best comic scene all season, where you have this alien come down and he's acting like Donald Trump. Basically, it's like, oh, we're going to build a space wall. You know, I'm sure you Earthers and you humans aren't all bad people, but most of you are rapists. Absolutely hilarious, brilliant episode. Anyway, we'll get into my number 7, which is Black Museum from Black Mirror. Another amazing episode from Black Mirror that had 3 different short stories within one story, but all built around this character who's very shady, who used to work in R&D for this tech company, and he did a lot of shady things to try to gain money, and it was very destroyed a lot of people's lives. And you get 3 stories in particular that was very dark and twisted, and they were done through this narrative of a girl visiting this black museum, and of course you find out that she has her own motives to get back at this guy, and it was absolutely amazing reveal, amazing episode. So anyway, next we'll get into my number 6 favorite episode of the year, and that is the showstopper from BOJACK Horseman. Now, this episode in particular, BOJACK was, I think, was very good season this year. It might have been my favorite season of the whole show. This episode in particular absolutely blew me away because it was building up to BOJACK's drug addiction and how he had an unhealthy relationship with a co-star of the TV show that he was working on. And this episode in particular was amazing because it showed elements of the show that he was working on, which Filbert, I think it was called, where he played a detective, and elements of BOJACK's real life and how they were starting to blend together. And because he was so addicted on these painkillers that he couldn't tell the difference between what was real and what wasn't. I think the way this played and the way that the episode was structured and how even the audience couldn't tell, and they kept mixing up like what was real, what wasn't. It had like very bizarre like musical numbers and stuff thrown in there, and it ends with him choking out his co-star because he can't tell that he thinks he's in the TV show, and he's going paranoid, and he's starting to think people's out to get them. It's a very tragic, very real commentary on drug addiction of this kind, and it really explores the type of characters much deeper, way deeper, and much more dark, emotionally impactful than any cartoon animated series about a talking horse has any right to be. It was absolutely amazing. So anyway, we'll get into my number 5 favorite episode of the year, and that is Dandelion Sky from The Expanse. Of course, another episode from The Expanse. Amazing episode from The Expanse. So this is when they're trapped inside the brain gate, and Holden goes off on his own on a mission with Miller to try to go into the center station, the heart of it, to try to put an end to the phenomenon that has all their ships trapped in this slow zone, I think they call it. And Holden encounters like Bobby Draper and the Martian Marines try to stop him and take him back, and it was interesting the Bobby having to deal with his inner conflict, and that scene at the end where she decides to shoot him anyway, but the station like freezes all the bullets in midair and takes that one Martian Marine and just rips him apart, and then Holden like actually completes the circuit that Miller's been telling him to complete, and he has this weird fucking vision of all these stars exploding and everything. Really amazing cinematography, editing, everything. It was a really mind-blowing experience, and the acting in this was amazing. I thought like Stephen Strait, who played Holden, was amazing in the whole entire season this year, but this is a shining example of a great performance by him. So it's an amazing episode. Okay, so next we'll get into my number 4, which is Winner from Better Call Saul. So this was the season finale of season 4 of Better Call Saul, and this episode I thought was really on point. As might be my favorite episode of Better Call Saul altogether, where Saul has to deal with the fact that he wanted to get his law license back, but he wasn't able to get it. He was being denied because he's pretending like his brother had no impact on his life, which the committee, of course, wouldn't know is not right, because it's the whole incident of why he lost his license had to do with his brother. So he puts on the show, and he puts on a con with Kim, and Kim sort of helps him to try to regain, to make it seem like he really cared about his brother. And in doing so, Jimmy actually convinces Kim that he was, very impacted by his brother and still very much loves him. But at the very end, it's revealed that's all a lie. And he calls the judges suckers for believing that. And of course, he doesn't realize, but he's actually referring to Kim. And then you also get a scene earlier in the episode, one of my favorite, where there's kids who are applying for scholarships, and Jimmy's really pulling for this one girl who had been caught shoplifting, but the other people in the committee dismiss her because they just call her a shoplifter, and he gives a really amazing speech about how she just needs to show those people up. People are going to continually put her down, not give her any help because they just look down on her as a shoplifter, but she needs to show them and fight them and show and become better than them. And it was an amazing speech because it's obviously that he was really talking about himself as well. So it was very meta. So this is a great episode. So anyway, next we'll get into my number 3, my third favorite episode of the year, and that is Crocodile from Black Mirror. And I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me because I know a lot of people actually hated this episode, although there are some people like me who loved it. I particularly loved this episode. I think it was one of the, simply from a craft, from the way it was written, from the way it was shot, from the way it was filmed, the way it was edited, particularly and especially the way it was acted. I think this episode features some of the best acting all year around. The acting in this episode is absolutely amazing. The episode itself was very twisted. I dare say this is the most disturbing, most twisted episode of Black Mirror yet. After watching it, it made me want to go in a corner and just cry myself to sleep, and just like go into fetal position and just cry. It was such a dark episode. It was so disturbing, and the reason why I think it was so dark and disturbing is because of the craft, the way it was pulled out. And unlike a lot of people saying, "Oh, I don't buy the character," I completely bought the character. I think the journey was extremely well constructed. This really explored the concept of sunken cost, where so once you do one thing, you're already invested, so you can't turn back now because that means everything you've done before was a waste of time. It just gets worse and worse and worse until it comes to an outrageous extreme, an extreme that for some people is a bit too outrageous to buy, but me, I bought it. I was there in the journey. I think the acting sold me. Great episode. Anyway, we'll get into my number 2, my second favorite episode of the year, and that is UTANGATTA, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Maniac. So this is the penultimate episode of Maniac, where you get the they're in a fantasy, and inside when they're taking the C pill, Annie and Owen are in a fantasy where it's like, I believe the 50s, and there's like a conference, international conference from the UN about these aliens that are coming to invade Earth and wipe it out. This is all just a fantasy, of course, but within the fantasy, they start to, Annie and Owen start to reconnect with actually who they are in real life, and then Owen's like delusion, his fantasy brother appears and says, this is you're here. It's like he was there the whole time to serve a purpose, and the purpose is to stop the computer, because the intelligent computer that's running these drug tests in the real life is like killing people and becoming crazy and talking about like taking Annie and making her catatonic, and so there's real stakes. But then Annie comes to terms with her past and learns to make peace with herself, and that was just such a emotional scene. And this, I love the mind-bendingness of Maniac. This probably wasn't at its best, and just the acting and everything was absolutely on point. Amazing episode. So finally, we get to my number 1 favorite episode of 2018, and that is Triple Point from the Expanse. Boy, do I ever love a good mutiny story. I've said this time again, I'm really on board on good mutiny stories, and this one was amazing. And I didn't see this one coming because it was changed up from the books. It didn't really do it this way in the books, and I think this change was done for the absolute better. It was absolutely amazing, even though it followed mostly minor characters, as it followed Admiral Souther and Admiral Wynn on board the UN ship, so we didn't get into our typical main characters. And I love that, though. I love that the show is willing to take the risk of focusing on these 2 characters, who are only side characters, and all the other characters aboard who were just introduced like 2 episodes ago. And they not only did they do that, but they did such an amazing job, and this is one of the most intense and best mutiny stories I've ever seen. I was like on the edge of my seat. The ending was very Tarantino-esque, and then you got the Martians who were able to side with Souther and the UN side, and then at the very end, when When he knew he was defeated, he had that evil smirk on his face as he released the proto-molecule hybrids and launched them towards Mars in order to wipe out all life on Mars. My God, that was so intense. That was so amazing. It's probably, the intense was beyond 10. It was like an 11. It was probably one of the most intense, suspenseful episodes I've ever seen ever. Making Triple Point my favorite episode of 2018. So anyway, that is it for my top 20 favorite episodes of 2018. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many of the shows I mentioned on this list, in particular The Expanse. I also cover other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Lost, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.